Hello, welcome we banded brothers and sisters here. Welcome, this is the Authors Hour. My name is Fred Zorn. I represent the Friends of the Chautauqua Writers Center. We are a volunteer group that aims to encourage writers and writing on the ground and beyond by both supporting and also supplementing the activities of the official institution Writers Center. Every week we have, for one thing, the Authors Hour on Thursdays at 12:15. On Sunday at 5 o'clock up on the second floor in what's called the Prose Room, we have open mic for both writers and listeners, 18 years old and older. On Tuesdays at 1:15 up in the Poetry Room, we have what's called an informal critique. A published writer will facilitate a discussion of one page of prose or poetry that you bring in. Ideally, bring in 10 copies, although 5 usually is enough, but occasionally we get more than 5. At halftime, I will talk about the special annual events that we sponsor. But we need to get to the authors. Both of them have books for sale up here. We're starting with Douglas Miller. He's a documentary filmmaker who has written, produced, and directed over 24 documentary films for the History Channel, Discovery, Various Independents, and others. The Greatest Escape, a true American Civil War adventure, is his first book based on 20 years of original research into our country's biggest prison breakout. Published by Lyons Press, it is now out in paperback. Mr. Miller and his wife, Carol Ramsey, are lifelong Chautauquans who spend the rest of the year at their home in Los Angeles, California. Take it away, Doug.
We didn't know we were going to be competing with the senator from New York. That's the way it works out. But so last time I spoke here a week ago, I talked about the book. Now I'm just going to read from the book. It is true. It's a story about. I'm trying to encapsulate this entire thing in a couple sentences. It's about America's greatest prison breakout. It happened in Richmond, Virginia, during the Civil War. They had a special prison just for Union officers, and it was considered escape-proof. It was supposed to house 500 officers. By the time of the escape, it had 1,200 officers jammed in this building that they were never let out. It was patrolled on the outside by guards. So it stood alone, but it was in the center of Richmond, and they figured it was escape-proof. And pardon my gum, I have a dry mouth problem, so I have to chew gum to keep me going. So you have to bear with me. So these guys are all in this prison. They figure it's escape-proof, but they're led by a guy named Colonel Rose, who's just an absolute, what you need in this case, an absolute escape fanatic. That's all he thinks about, and all he pays attention to. He keeps trying things. He keeps getting guys organized, and then they figure out this elaborate way to get out of the prison. And 1 second, water here. So here I'm bringing in, now that's the setup for the whole story, but I'm bringing another interesting character, who's this woman named Elizabeth Van Loo, who lived in Richmond, was possibly the wealthiest person in Richmond. And she plays an important supporting role in this story. I'm amazed she's not famous, but she isn't. She's not at all well known. But anyway, this is how she shows up in my book for the first time. From the garden of her magnificent home atop Church Hill, Miss Elizabeth Van Loo could look down on the grim POWs staggering into Libby Prison just a few blocks away. Church Hill was where many of Richmond's wealthy lived, and it provided commanding views of the city below. For decades, the Cole and Van Loo mansion have been a social and political destination for the South elite. John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, had been a regular visitor. Elizabeth had seen Edgar Allan Poe read The Raven to guests in the drawing room. Just a block away stood the famous St. John's Church, where, 407 years earlier, Patrick Henry had declared, "Give me liberty or give me death." Elizabeth's father had been a successful hardware merchant. She grew up amid splendor and slaves. The family rode about Richmond in an expensive carriage pulled by 6 white horses. Elizabeth never married. She was said to have been betrayed by a faithless lover. And after her father passed away in 1843, she lived in the giant house with her elderly mother, a few relatives, and a half-dozen slaves. Everyone in Richmond knew the Van Loo. When the war began, Elizabeth was in her 40s, short, scrappy, and full of energy. In her youth, she had been considered a beauty, but that was fading. Her neighbors knew her as an intense, independent soul. They also remembered that before the war, she had not been afraid to declare her opposition to slavery and secession. They knew she had gone so far as to deliver food and books to the hated Yankee prisoners in the city. As a result, she was shunned by upright Southerners, but was otherwise left alone with her eccentricity. Who cared what some aging spinster thought about politics or the war anyway? What Confederates in their capital city did not know was that, by the middle of 1863, Elizabeth Van Loo had already developed the underground network that would make her the most effective spy master of the Civil War. From her estate overlooking Libby Prison, Van Loo ran an intensely loyal group of informers, spies, slaves, ex-slaves, and saboteurs. Like her, they were lifelong Richmonders who had refused to give up their faith in the United States. They lived among slavery, and they hated it. In his 1996 study, The Secret War for the Union, Edwin Fischel called Miss Van Loo's effort, quote, "the most productive espionage operation of the war performed by either side." By the end of the war, Van Loo's ring was so efficient that her encrypted reports were being delivered across Union lines almost daily, often wrapped around a fresh rose cut from her garden. Now, they're trying to do this is a little bit, not that difficult to explain, because I don't have, I can't show you my pictures that I have in the book, but they're essentially, what they end up doing is they tunnel into a wall. There's a fireplace. They take the bricks, not use fireplace, they take the bricks out. They dig into the wall in like an S shape, and they come out at the room down here, a catty corner room called Rat Hill that nobody goes into because it's so gross and disgusting. But to the inmates, that's the way out. So they start digging, takes them days and days and days. They take the bricks apart carefully, they remove them, and and then every night they put them back in there and rebuild the whole thing. They do this for weeks. Then they finally decide they're ready to go down into the room. And they put Colonel Rose, he's the man in charge, so he's the man down, and ties a rope around his waist and starts down into the hole. It's the chapter called Tight Fit. The opening into the east cellar, Rat Hell, was finally ready. Colonel Rose wanted to be the first down. As instigator of the escape plan, he was determined to carry success or failure on his own shoulders. Maybe the rebels were waiting, would immediately throw him into the dungeon. But whatever might happen, Rose wanted to get on with it. The very next night, the two men, his partner Hamilton, brought down their stolen rope to the kitchen where they had secretly dug out the fireplace. They moved the cook stove away from the opening. They discussed the size of the S-shaped path they had created, knowing it would make for a tight fit. But Major Hamilton was a mason, and he contended that enlarging the pathway risked collapse of the timber. The kitchen was dark and empty. Rose and Hamilton moved the bricks from the fireplace to open the pathway. They attached the rope to a support post in the kitchen, and Rose began inching his way inside. Here's Rose, quote, "I entered it feet foremost, at the same time seizing the rope. As soon as my feet and legs were dangling below, the inevitable law of gravitation forced my body into the hole as tight as a wedge. The fireplace was so narrow, and my body in such a position that I could not use my arm. And of course, I could not use my feet, so that I was perfectly helpless. Of all the tight places that I was ever in before or since, that took the lead. I whispered to Hamilton that I was so wedged that I feared the whole Southern Confederacy could not loosen. The Colonel Rose, was worse than stuff. Any movement made him slide down lower, jamming his chest so tightly it was getting harder for him to breathe. At last, as their friend Lieutenant Moran described it, quote, each effort only wedged him more firmly in the awful vice. Rose was gasping for breath and rapidly getting fainter. But even in this fearful strait, he refrained from an outcry that would certainly alarm the guard just outside the door. Rose was suffocating. His torso was caught in the middle of the edge while his feet dangled over open space. Every move made him stick tighter, as if a python were wrapping around him. As Rose told it, he meant Hamilton was a powerful man, and he grasped my left wrist with both hands, while with my right hand I endeavored to help myself. He pulled with the strength of a giant, but it was of no use. I could not be budged an inch. He then left me sticking in the hole and ran upstairs. A panicked Hamilton dashed through the dark rooms and up the stairs to where the POWs were sleeping in endless tight rows. They were so packed together that entire rows had to turn over in unison. Hamilton ran right over the top of them, trampling heads and hands and backs in his dash to reach one of their co-conspirators. Curses and debris followed the major as he flew to the sleeping place of a Major Fitzsimmons, but he wasn't there. Luckily, Hamilton quickly located a Lieutenant Bennett. They both dashed over the rows of men and down to the kitchen. I should have mentioned, nobody knows these guys are doing this. They have to keep it secret, not only from the guards, but from everybody else in the prison. The two grabbed Rose's arm, and after some vigorous tugs, managed to pull him up enough so he could catch his breath. Quote, says Rose, as they gave another tremendous pull, I became up so light that we all three fell upon the floor with a prodigious noise. The sentinel who walked in front of the door seemed startled and confused. The prisoners upstairs called to each other to inquire the cause of the crash. We all three lay where we fell, perfectly motionless and breathless. The corporal of the guard did not come into the room, and as soon as all was quiet again, we rose, replaced the dirt bricks in the stove, slipped upstairs, and went to bed, very much fatigued and considerably discouraged. How are we doing on time? Good. So here's a quick story. This book is heavy on first-person accounts. These guys were all officers, so they all could read and write well. That's why I have so many great accounts. So this is a short story told by a Colonel McCreary, who was in a prison hospital with another guy named Major Halstead, who explained to him while they were in the hospital, quote unquote, it was not much of a hospital. This is guy, Colonel McCreary, here's telling the story about his friend Major Halstead. Before the war, he was a tailor in New York. He visited my cot frequently. One day, he became very confidential and informed me that he was to start for home the next night. I inquired if he had been exchanged, and he replied, "It is a special exchange. The surgeon and I are great friends. Indeed, he has been very kind to me, but how can I repay him? I said to him a few days ago, Doctor, I am a first-class tailor. If you will bring me a good piece of Confederate gray cloth, together with the trimming, soldier straps, etc., I will gladly cut, fit, and make the suit with my own hands." I took his measure and have made the finest Confederate major's uniform you ever saw to fit my own dear self. I start for home tomorrow night to see my wife and babies. The major's parade abused every POW in Libby. Most of them retold the story in their memoirs, among them an admiring Lieutenant Cavada. Quote, he coolly walked out of the hospital accompanied by another federal patient, also disguised, and not only walked out the door, but all the way down the peninsula into the federal line. He had the admirable impudence to adopt his victim's title as well as his coat, and assuming considerable errors, gave himself out as a Confederate surgeon on duty in Richmond Hospice. The next morning at roll call, the major was missing, and the surgeon was mourning the loss of his new uniform and cursing the damn Yankees. Mercury wrote. A few days afterward, I received a letter postmarked New York containing this announcement. The tailor is himself again. So, how am I doing? Okay, so here's a wild part. Here's another. They had this tunnel. So they dug this tunnel through they had to go under the street, come up the other side. So they have to dig a tunnel with at least, well, longer than this porch, imagine. Come up under this road. It has about this much clearance on your shoulders, nothing above and below. You can only go in one way. If you want to get out, you have to back out. There's nothing supporting anything. So you cave in, you're dead. And they dig this for weeks. They finally get through, but the biggest problem is they can't get air into the tunnel. So when you get down at the end of the tunnel, you're almost asphyxiated, even though they're blowing air the best they can into the tunnel. So that's the setup. And again, here's our man, Colonel Rose, being described by his friend who was there with him, Lieutenant Moran, saying, this is it. We can't wait around anymore. We think it's better. I will go in and finish the tunnel. I'm the man, I'm the most dedicated, I'm the craziest. So he digs all the way into the tunnel, Colonel Rose. He took up the chisel and he didn't turn it over again. Quote, as midnight approached, Rose was nearly a physical wreck. Perspiration dripped from every pore of his exhausted body. His staggering senses warned him that faint where he was meant death. He could scarcely inflate his lungs with the poisonous air. His head swam like that of a drowning person. The small candle he had with him for illumination sputtered from the lack of oxygen. His limbs began to weaken, then spasm from the physical strain. Still Rose dug onward until he felt he had gone inside the fenced area where they wanted to end the tunnel. There he stopped digging for it and he turned upward. Clods of dirt fell all around him as he worked on. Retreat was now out of the question. He knew he had to break through or be asphyxiated. Again, as I mentioned, Moran interviewed Rose after the war and penned this dramatic conclusion about the end. Quote, Colonel Rose's strength was nearly gone. The feeble strain of air which his comrade was trying with all his might to send in could no longer reach him. His senses reeled. He had not breath nor strength enough to retreat backwards through his narrow grave. In the agony of suffocation, he dropped the dull chisel and beat his fist against the roof of his grave with the might of despair. Wind, blessed boon, the crust gave way, and the loosened earth showered upon his dripping face. His famished eye caught sight of a radiant star in the blue vault above him. A flood of light and a volume of cool, delicious air poured over him. At that very instant, the sentinel's cry rang out like a prophecy. 1:30, and all was well. So, this is where I had these quotes. Who's going to improve on that, This guy talked to him, here he's telling us the story, so all you do is have to set it up and put it there. Now, I'll read one more story. Very interesting part is when they get out of it, 109 of them get out of this thing, but they're in the center of the Confederacy. So they've still got to get 50 miles to Union Line. It's really cold. It's in February. They have no warm clothes. They have no food. They are weakened because they've been in prison for months. But they had no other choice. So they set off in ones and twos and threes across the countryside. If you know the layout, east of Richmond is Colonial Williamsburg. That's where the Union Army is. So they have to get that 50 miles. It's all swampy. It's horrible territory, and every white person in Virginia is trying to catch it. But what they don't realize, and certainly the whites don't realize, is that the slave community is aware of what's going on. We don't quite know how. We think it's through Elizabeth Van Leeuwen's network. But this is a story of what happens when they start to get desperate and they really need help. This is a chapter called Saved by Slaves. So, Colonel Harrison Hobart is telling this story. It was my turn to act the part of pilot. While rapidly leading the way through a wood of low pines, I suddenly found myself in the presence of a cavalry reserve. The men were warming themselves by a blazing fire and their horses were tied to trees. I was surprised and alarmed, but recovering my self-possession, I remained motionless, carefully putting one foot behind the other. I retreated out of sight and rapidly returned to my party. After much discussion, the four men decided to take the chance of returning to a plantation they had passed. They would try approaching one of the rough slave cabins, which by design were built well out of sight of the main house. The POWs were so desperate they felt they had no choice. Colonel Hobart volunteered to do the talking while the others lay in the grass. He rapped at the door. A slave woman replied. Hobart launched into a tale about being a lost traveler who needed information about the roads nearby. Through the door, she directed them to the Mass's house, but Hobart would not budge. He could hear conversation inside, and eventually the door opened. Quote, this is never great, his account. I was surprised to find a large, good-looking Negro standing by her side who had been listening to the interview. He invited me to come in, and as soon as the door was closed, he said, I know who you are. You're one of them escaped officers from Richmond. Looking him full in the face, I placed my hand firmly upon his shoulder and said, yes, I am, and I know you are my friend. His eyes sparkled as he repeated, yes, sir, but you mustn't stay here. A regiment of cavalry is right there, pointing to a place nearby, and they passed this road all times of the night. The Negro proved to be a sharp, shrewd fellow. Another officer was listening, and he continues the story of McCreary trying to argue with this man. This slave said, we are here because we know that every black man is a friend of the Union soldier and of the cause. We know you will not betray us. We are in trouble, and we seek information in regard to the rebel picket line. Can you and will you aid us? Yes, I can and will, he replied. But if it should ever be known, my life will pay the forfeit. I am a slave. I have a wife and two children who look to me for protection. I will do all I can for you, but remember, I am in great danger. After giving the escapees milk and cornbread, the slave led them to a concealed thicket in the woods, where we sat down on a log and listened to all he had to say. He was intelligent, thoroughly acquainted with every foot of the country, but he would not consent to act as our pilot, fearing he might be discovered. Yet the Yankee officers continued to push their case. According to Hobart, quote, after impressing us in his strongest language with the danger both to him and to us of making the least noise, he conducted us through the long canebrake path and then through several fields. The slave would ultimately lead them silently for 3 miles until they had passed all the local Confederate cavalry. He then gave them useful instructions on the way to Yankee lines. The 4 prisoners were quite aware that they wouldn't have had little chance of getting this far on their own, wrote McCreary. Quote, we gave the Negro all the money we had, and bidding goodbye, we started for home. He started for home, and we for Union lines. If good deeds are recorded in heaven, this slave's name appeared in the record that night.
Wow.
So, that's it. We're having we have something from bookshelf, books, and a special discount. But they also have them in the bookstore if you want to go there. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. I can't help but think there's an analogy between Colonel Rose persistently digging that tunnel and you persistently digging into the past to unearth those inspiring stories. Thank you so much. Just a few words about special events that the Friends of the Chicago Writers Center sponsored. Unfortunately, at this point in the season, they're all in past tense. This past Sunday, we presented the awards for our annual writing contest. I think there was an article in the paper a day ago. That writing contest ended in July, but will occur again next year. We had the favorite poem project, where selected Chautauquan and Scott City has been able to take their favorite poems and briefly explain why those poems mean so much to them. That occurred in the Hall of Philosophy, as did the awards ceremony. On Vista Plaza back in July, we had a book fair for Chautauquan authors. And at the very beginning of the year, this past year, and at least hope plans for next year, we had a reception to kick off the season to those people interested in writing and reading, so literary arts in general. You want to put in a brief plug for our sister arts, the Chautauqua Theater Company, who will be putting on a new play workshop, a stage reading, meaning that it will have stage movement and costumes and such. It's just that they will still have scripts in hand of a play called The Bleeding Class. Unfortunately, as you've heard, Tiny Father, which is a marvelous play, was canceled due to health reasons. I caught it in previews, and if it resurfaces, as I think it probably will someplace, it's not in New York City, catch it. But on to our second author, Dr. Shahid Aziz. He's the director of pediatric palliative care and hospice programs at Montgomery Hospice in Rockville, Maryland. Of all places, that's where my wife and I live. His medical degree is from King Edward's Medical College in Lahore, Pakistan. His pediatric training was at University of Maryland, St. Agnes and Mercy Hospitals in Maryland. That's Baltimore, Maryland. He was assistant chair of pediatrics at St. Agnes, plus chair of pediatrics, chair of ethics committee, and vice president of medical affairs at MedStar Harbor Hospital. His vast experience in pediatrics, clinical medical ethics, palliative care, and hospice care, he has rather vast experience. He is board certified in pediatrics, medical management, and hospice and palliative medicine. He has served on the clinical teaching faculty at University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins. Teaching being one of his passions, he continues to teach to all medical personnel and the general public. Communication and advanced care planning and palliative care are his major interests. He is a published author on that subject. His book titled Courageous Conversations on Dying, A Gift of Palliative Care is available here, but if for some reason you don't buy it today, even though you get a chance to have it signed today, it's also available on Amazon. Dr. Z.
Thank you, Fred. Nice to be here. Thank you all for coming. Want to thank Fred again for allowing a non-fiction book to be talked about, but it does have story. So, and I guess as a physician, I never thought I was going to write a book, but life leads you. And then you say, I think this might be helpful. So the book actually came about from my experience in hospice and palliative medicine, taking care of patients with severe illnesses, terminal illnesses, and so on. And in my life, as you heard, once I got to medical ethics and started seeing how poorly we manage the end of life, I decided to work in that and gave up general pediatrics, reboarded in hospice and palliative medicine. And then from my experience, and this is a new field, the palliative medicine, I then had enough experience to put a lot of it down. So the book is helpful as a guide to physicians, healthcare providers, as well as the public in this end of life conversation and handling these. So, so this book can help everybody in that regard. And my major emphasis has been on what we call advanced care planning. And as one of the quotes it says, is that advanced care planning is the key to decreasing suffering at the end of life for all concerned. But it's not only the person who is dying that is suffering, but so is the family. not necessarily with physical pain, but with a lot of emotional and spiritual pain. So this process can help all of us that are involved in that situation. The second part of the title says the gift of palliative care. So how is this book a gift, and what is that gift? This process of advanced care planning allows patients to articulate their goals and drives the plan of care to determine what treatments to offer in order to achieve these goals. Thus, holding these difficult conversations is a gift that the palliative care team, consisting of physicians, nurses, social workers, nurse practitioners, chaplains, and more, offers to the patient, the family, and other healthcare providers, and all those who support their patients, with focus on all aspects of suffering, physical, emotional, psychosocial, and spiritual. This work completed by the palliative care team becomes a gift to other clinicians who do not have the time or the expertise to engage in this difficult task. It is also a gift to the patient because having had the talk about future goals, the remainder of his or her life will be lived in a manner that makes the most sense. Conversations about death and dying and advanced care planning that clearly define one's important goals and wishes is a gift to one's family, probably one of the best gifts one can give to one's children and loved ones. The family can now be guided by these wishes if the capacity for decision making is lost, and one or more members of the family must make decisions at this emotional time. This reduces the burden on the family since the plan of care is now based on the patient's voice, wishes, values, and goals. The family can be at peace with their decisions, knowing they are making the right decision as well as honoring their loved one's wishes. When a patient's wishes are not known, or helping the family make hard choices that alleviate suffering is a gift from us to the family and from the family to the dying patient. As stated by one of my patient's family members, the sister of a 53-year-old lady in the terminal stages of cerebral palsy said, "Letting our sister die in peace now is a gift from us to her." So the question of hope comes up all the time. You know, if you're talking about death and dying and there's a patient that may be there, near the end you're taking away the hope, and we can never take away the hope. So I like to talk more about not just the hope, but of the realistic hope. So one detail that separates the palliative care physicians from other specialists in medicine is that we are charged with giving our patients hope that is realistic without being defeated. So what do I mean by that? We can help our patients to understand the true nature of their disease progression from beginning with realistically, I would expect the following, and then perhaps ending the questions like, what are you hoping for? What are your fears? What are your desired results? And what is the meaningful for you at a minimum? Hope changes as time and disease march on. What begins as hope for a mistaken diagnosis becomes a hope for a miracle from a second opinion. Then it becomes hope for a cure, then hope for another remission, and hope for a little more time, followed by hope for less pain, and finally, hope to end suffering. Hope for another year, month, week, day, or even an hour of good time spent together is hope that is worthwhile. I found this beautifully illustrated by the father of one of my patients. His 16-year-old daughter was actively dying of brain cancer and was in a comatose state. During my home visit, he confided in me that he hoped for just one more moment of looking in her eyes like he had done the day before. So this father said, "You know, Doc, yesterday she opened her eyes. So I just lay in bed with her and gazed into her eyes for a good 45 minutes. That was the best day. Now I'm just hoping for one more moment like that again." So the families hang on to little moments like that to make, because it's just hard. So the hope has changed from pure and longer life to this moment. And then, of course, for a peaceful end. If we accept death, we all say we accept death. We all say we know we're going to die. We know that's part of life. But accepting it at a deeper level makes the end so much easier and kinder for the patient and the family. So I have a story about accepting death. It's a personal story of my father to show how accepting death made the ending what it is. I was 20 years away from becoming a palliative care physician when I began to have end-of-life discussions with my father. Looking back now, I'm not sure that I was even aware of what I was doing at the time. But I do know that it was this experience with my father that actually taught me how to think about goals of living at the end of life. He called me, his son, the doctor from Pakistan, to say that he was having pain in his left arm when he went for 2 to 3 miles walk. He loved walking after dinner, long and fast. When I was a teenager, I would often walk with him, but could hardly keep up with it. The pain ended up being an early sign of angina, which sublingual medication helped him cope with fairly well. He was still able to walk for miles, drive his car, live alone. A few years later, he called me. Now his angina was getting worse. He said his pain was occurring when he walked only a mile, or even less, and seemed to be getting stronger. Fearing an inevitable heart attack, I advised him that his heart vessels were probably narrowing, but that this was fixable. I urged him to come to the United States so that this could be taken care of. Otherwise, he was risking a heart attack. And he did. He understood, but made excuses. It was difficult to travel. He was grateful and very happy to have lived such a wonderful life, to have seen all his children grow up, get married, have grandchildren. He was thankful to God and missed his wife, my mother, who had died over 10 years earlier. "No," he said, "I'm ready to go. I miss your mom. I wish to live as long as possible, but on my own, and I do not want to be dependent on anyone else." So he's defining what is a meaningful life for him. When my time comes, I hope he takes me quickly without dependence on others. That is my wish. So a few weeks later, my wife and I are lying in bed, we're reading, when I suddenly smell this strong, sweet rose aroma. So I asked my wife, "Are you wearing perfume?" I'm feeling pretty good. He said, "No." A few minutes later, I again smelled the sweet odor. And I again asked my wife if she was sure she was not wearing perfume. She denied again, maybe a little annoyed by this time, and my repetitious question. That night I dreamed that I was at a hillside resort, and this wonderful man, my father, Abajan, we call him in my language, and whom I loved so much, met me in a place of worship, looking marvelously healthy and at peace. He gave me the longest embrace that I can ever remember. The next morning, I told my wife that I think my dad, or perhaps both my parents, had come to visit me, and that I had better call home. In our culture, when people die, we put odors and odors of rose petals all around the body. We don't embalm. And there's always this rose aroma is always there. So I'm thinking, oh, looks like they came to visit me. That's the only connection I could make. Something's up with the Bajan, I said. But in my hurry to get to work, I did not get to call. Later that day, my brother called, telling me that my father had died suddenly of a heart attack. If I ever had a doubt about whether we had soul, it was a race. I think about this event often and marvel at my father's courage, understanding, faith, and acceptance. He knew that his time had come, and he wanted to leave this world living and dying the way he wanted. He wanted to leave it without being dependent on others for care and walking on his own, which he still did at the age of 84. I believe my father was able to achieve this by accepting death in its time. I can be helpful for those of us who are left behind. It can be helpful for those of us who are left behind to think of the departed as having passed on the next chapter in their lives on their own terms. As I struggle with what has to be one of the saddest times in my life, apart from the death of my mother, my wife Jean gave me a framed poem to help me cope and accept the loss of my father. This poem, written by Mary Elizabeth Fry, hanged in my room. Don't stand at my grave and weep. I'm not there. I don't sleep. I'm a thousand winds that blow. I'm the diamond brimstone of snow. I'm the sunlight in ripened grain. I'm the gentle autumn rain. When you awaken in the morning's hush, I'm the sister of lifting rudge, of quiet birds in circle flight. I'm the soft star that finds the night. Do not stand at my grave and cry. I'm not there. I did not doubt. Perhaps as we see the wonders of everyday life, those of us who are physicians and healers can learn to accept that death is eventually final thought. Once we embrace this acceptance within ourselves, we can be helpful to others who need us so dearly in their time of pain and sorrow. So since I do pediatric hospice, so people always ask me, how do you do that? Why aren't you depressed all the time? My answer is no, because we have accepted what is norm in life, which is that children die every day and they die at every day. So you not only have to be 95 or 100. So we are sad for them, but we are not depressed because we are helping them through this time to make their life as good as possible. So that would be our work, and that's good. So how do we have this conversation that are going to have the end for us? So we owe it to ourselves and our families to have these end-of-life conversations with our loved ones, and as physicians, we owe it to our patients to address their end-of-life goals or by means of advanced care planning in a timely fashion, while they still have the decision-making capacity. So therefore, the time to dialogue is now, while you have this capacity, whether if you have a serious illness or not. As physicians, again, it's our responsibility to help establish clear goals of care, then guide the plan of care upon patients' wishes. The goal is to maintain the patient at a minimum acceptable level of functioning or better. Finding out what the patient envisions that life to be can be achieved by asking the three questions. And the three questions are, what is the minimum level of mental functioning that is acceptable to you if your life is being prolonged by artificial means, whether it be medicine, machine, or artificially provided food and water? Second question is, what is the minimum level of physical functioning that is acceptable to you with the help of life-prolonging treatment? And the third question is, what, if any, life-prolonging treatments or life-prolonging treatments are acceptable to you, or acceptable for a period of time to see if we can get you to the minimum acceptable level of function? And are there any known treatments that you're opposed to? So, for example, if you are terribly sick, doctors have said there's no more treatment for your cancer, and you're gradually getting closer to the end, then you will probably say, if my heart stops, I don't want to be resuscitated. You're saying no to that treatment because of no. So there are treatments that you can ahead of time think about that would not be helpful to you. So with these answer to these questions can help us get there. So if you have this conversation, let's say with your family, and you talk about those areas, then you have lost your capacity to make decisions. Your children have to make decisions for you. A huge burden. But you're taking the burden away because you already told them. You already made your decision how you want to be and not want to. The best gift you can ever give. So this conversation many times will lead into a written document we call the advanced directive. But doesn't have to be. If you do not have that written document, then at least having the conversation can be helpful. So this is so we have a, let's see how long is it for? Maybe 2 minutes. Okay. So we had this patient, the maid Mary, so I'm going to give you an example of how just having a conversation can be helpful. The Mary was 93 years old with mild dementia. She could let you know how she was feeling, but could not make sense otherwise, and could not make her own decision. She had contraction on her legs, lay in bed most of the time, but she could get up with help. So she stubbed her foot, got gangrene. Doctor said they need to amputate. The family was asked to consent for the. Then they said, well, we need to talk to somebody to see how. So I got involved in the process. So when we talked to the man, our family further, they said that he used to say, I never want to lie in a bed of affliction. So based on that one sentence, the family sent him home. I said to think about it and keep her wishes in mind. So the family made the decision with the help of this comment and the guidance of the palliative care team. They decided not to have the surgery because although that would give her a longer life, she would definitely be lying in a bed of affliction, which she did not want to. So they opted for hospice, took her home, and let her play with the grandchildren, have no extra pain, and let God take her time as God. The family was at peace with their decision since they felt they were following her voice. So that's the gift that she gave her children by just having that conversation. Okay, are we almost done? Okay, I'm gonna just read a couple of quotes for you. First one by Alexander the Great, who said, I'm dying with the help of too many physicians. And that is, believe it or not, happening even these days here. Fisher said, expect an early death. It will keep you busier. Life is a sexually transmitted disease that's always fatal. If the rich could hire other people to die for them, the poor would make a wonderful living. Death is not the worst thing, rather when one who craves death cannot attain that wish. With that comes now, you see all this emphasis on physician aid and dying. So, thank you for my time. My seminars are on Mondays at 3:30, all of the chapel and Presbyterian, where we talk this in more detail. It usually have average about 50 people show up, so if you have time, please come. And this coming Monday is the last one.
Thank you, Dr. Shahid, for your professional wisdom and their personal experience. Just a few announcements before I let you happy to go. Today at 3:30 in the Hall of Philosophy, the CLSC Author of the Week, Adam Huschchild, will be speaking about his book, American Midnight. 3:30 on Sunday in the Hall of Philosophy, the final writers of the week will be speaking. We have a married duo for poetry. Michael Waters and Michaela Massolini will be speaking, and they're offering a workshop, perhaps fittingly called The Merge. And Lenore Micah will be speaking. She's the prose writer in residence, offering a workshop called Tricking Ourselves. Next week's Author's Hour will feature Jeannie Blanca, a poet, author of the provocatively titled collection Walking Naked Under a Yellow Rain Slicker. And Henry Danielson will be reading from his various memoirs about sailing around the world, including Island People, Deep Water Dreams. Anyway, thank you for coming. As has been said a few times, books are for sale here. Take care. Bye.